This video provides an overview of implementing WilloWare's LabelLink for Dynamics GP. The intended audience is a technical user, somebody who will be hands-on in installing and configuring the software, writing and deploying reports. You should be well versed in writing SQL queries and doing database reporting. WilloWare's LabelLink is one part of a complete label printing solution. In addition to LabelLink, you also need a label printer with barcode label stock and a label design software package such as NiceLabel. There are other label design software packages that can be used with LabelLink, such as WASP Labeler from WASP Barcode Technologies, Bartender from Seagull Scientific, or Zebra Designer. WilloWare's LabelLink acts as an intermediary between Dynamics GP and the label design software that you're using. LabelLink pulls data from a transaction, such as a purchase order receipt, formats it into labels, and then activates the label printing software. The label printing software reads data from the database and sends it to the printer. In most cases where LabelLink has an existing integration for a label design software package, such as NiceLabel, the NiceLabel software is really used in the background as a printing engine. This isn't visible from within Dynamics GP. LabelLink will launch the label design software, print the labels, and then shut the label design software back down. All of this being invisible to the Dynamics GP user, the end result being that labels pop out of the label printer. The LabelLink installation process will create a SQL view called LabelLink. This will be the base table used when you create any of your label reports. The LabelLink view contains columns from a large number of tables for all of the GP transactions supported by LabelLink. For example, it pulls together a header table with the detail table and the serial lot table, and then it will also include master record tables. So the view itself contains a large amount of information and simplifies the task of creating label reports because there's just one table to write the report against. While you could modify the LabelLink view to add additional information into it if needed, we recommend that you don't do that because we will periodically drop the LabelLink view and recreate it if we need to add additional columns. A common need is to create a custom barcode field which contains several concatenated fields. The easiest way to do that is to create your own view using the LabelLink view as your base table, and then concatenate the fields together, adding additional column in your own view. The LabelLink view also formats the data. It strips out trailing spaces, for example. All of the GP string fields have trailing spaces, and when you try to put this onto a barcode label, that will cause the barcode to try to print those spaces. It can also cause formatting and positioning issues on the labels because the label writing software will think that the field is a lot bigger than it is because it will always see those trailing spaces. The LabelLink view also formats date and time fields into strings, and the strings are easier to put onto the labels. Oftentimes when you try to pull just a native date onto a label, you get additional formatting that doesn't look very good on the label. The other thing that LabelLink does is it will create one record in the LabelLink view per label that you need to print. So if you're printing multiple copies of each label, rather than trying to format that or present that in the label writing software, your label design can simply pull the data out of the LabelLink table and print whatever's in there. Since LabelLink pulls data out of GP and out of each of the transactions that are supported by LabelLink and puts it into the LabelLink view, your label report only has to look at one table. The benefit of this is that if you need to print labels from PO receipts and maybe on sales transactions, maybe also from inventory adjustments or smart lists, rather than having to create a separate label for each one of those different locations that pulls in the tables from those different transactions or locations. With LabelLink, you just create one report, and that one report pulls from LabelLink. LabelLink, working from inside of GP, takes care of figuring out where all that data needs to come from and sticks it all into this one table. So writing the reports is quite a bit easier because you just link to the LabelLink view and then pull in columns off of that view onto the report. You also don't need to worry about handling the number of copies or duplicates because LabelLink will populate the LabelLink view with one record per label that needs to print. We'll now jump into GP and take a look at some of the setup involved in GP to make LabelLink work. When creating labels, we like to start by doing some setup in GP because it will allow you to create some sample data which will help when creating the label reports. You could start directly in Nice Label, for example, and link to the LabelLink view and drop tables onto the label design, but it's hard to see whether or not it's working. So if you start inside of GP and do a little bit of setup, it'll allow you to populate the LabelLink view, which then allows you to see on the label whether or not you're getting what you expect to see. The LabelLink setup is in the company setup, and you go to Setup LabelLink. For the labeler software, since we're going to be using Nice Label, we'll select Nice Label from the drop-down. The other options are Other Software, WASP Labeler, and CodeSoft. When there's a package listed here that has a specific name, such as Nice Label or CodeSoft, that means that LabelLink supports one-click printing. And what one-click printing is the end user won't see the label design software. LabelLink communicates directly with that label design software and uses it more as a print engine. So when it prints, it launches it in the background, loads the label design, and sends data out to the label printer. And then it shuts down the label design software. All of that happens in the background. The end user doesn't see it. The only thing that they see is they click print on LabelLink and the labels pop out of the label printer. If you're using a label design software package that doesn't support one-click printing, you'll select Other. What Other does is when you click print, it launches the label design software itself. So when the user clicks print, the next thing that'll happen is Bartender from Siegel Scientific will pop open. It'll already have their label loaded. They won't have to do anything in it other than click print inside of that software and then close it down. The next step is to tell LabelLink what the path to the label design software executable is. So again, here we're using Nice Label. Now, to get sample data into the LabelLink view, there's a bit of chicken and egg situation because when you launch LabelLink from a PO receipt, for example, the first thing LabelLink is going to do is see whether or not your GP user ID has a label assigned to it. Now, it's not actually looking for a label, and it doesn't validate what's in the file field. So really what it's looking for is that a record exists for your user ID. So when we write reports, what we like to do is start by just creating a default record for the SA user, for example, and just select any file. So here we've selected one of the DLLs in the Nice Label application folder. This doesn't make any difference because we're not going to launch it or use it, but it tells LabelLink that the setup is complete. One thing to keep in mind with your label design is that you will need to create one label per user who is going to print labels, or one label per workstation that will print labels. So if you have a workstation in receiving, for example, and you have multiple personnel who use that same computer to print labels, then you can just have one label tied to that machine ID. And machine ID will be one of the columns in the LabelLink view, and we'll look at that a little bit later. On the other hand, if you only have one station that's going to print labels, then you don't need any restriction, because there's only going to be either that one machine printing or multiple users from that one machine. In either case, there won't be multiple GP clients trying to create labels at the same time. What LabelLink does when you print labels is it populates all of the records for the labels into one table. A couple of the key columns in that table are machine ID and user ID. And that's how it keeps users' labels separate from each other. If you have multiple people printing labels at the same time, or multiple different GP clients printing labels at the same time, then you need to build your reports with a restriction so that it will be able to separate whose labels are being printed. So at this point, this is all the setup we need to have here to get started. To get some sample data for creating labels, we're going to use a PO receipt. So pull up the PO receipt in GP, and then go to Additional LabelLink. Now you can see that LabelLink pulls in the items from the PO receipt. At this point, it's creating one label per serial number. If we had multiple lot numbers, we'd also have one record per lot. You can restrict what's going to print by removing non-tracked items or removing serial tracked items. Or you might remove non-tracked and lot and just keep the serial. The reason that you might want to do this is you might need a different type of label for each type of inventory. Perhaps lot numbered inventory gets one particular label and serial numbered inventory gets a different type of label. If you did that, you'd set up 2 or 3 different label types, and they'd all show up in this drop-down. You'd select the label for serial numbers, you'd exclude the items that are not serial tracked, and then you'd click the print button to print those labels. There are a couple of other unique things about this window. The column headers, which normally this blue underline would indicate that it's a zoom and would take you back to the item master. These are actually filters. So when you click item number, you can change the display to just show one of the items. The label per changes the label per setting for all of the items in the display. If everything is showing per transaction unit of measure, you'll get one label per transaction U of M. So if you're receiving cases, you'd get one label per case. If you change it to base unit of measure and you're receiving in cases, you would then get one label per each. Lastly, the copy setting allows you to change the number of copies for all of the items in the display. So once you get to this point, the way to actually get data into the LabelLink view is to click the preview button. When you can see data in preview, you know that there's data in the LabelLink view, and once there's data in the LabelLink view, you'll be able to pull it into the label writing software package, and that will help you know that you're getting the right information. We find that it's a lot easier to do it that way rather than creating the report and then coming back into GP, clicking print and trying to run the report and print labels. That creates a lot of circular going back and forth. This way, there's just data in the table, and we can sit inside nice label, drop some fields on the report, do a print preview, and make sure that we're getting everything we need to see. One other thing to point out when we're here is that you can also remove individual lines from this display. So, for example, with 100 XLG, perhaps the first time we printed, we didn't get all of the labels and we just need to reprint one of the serial numbers. You could come back into this window, remove everything except for the serial number that we want to print. You can also edit individual labels. These user-defined fields here, these are user-defined fields just for the label. So these are fields that are populated by LabelLink. They're not coming from SOP user-defined fields or item user-defined fields. This gives you a place where you can manually key in some information and have that show up on the labels. Okay, so we've got some sample data. We'll go over to NiceLabel and start the process of designing our first label. To begin creating reports, the first thing that you will need to do is create a ODBC connection to be used by the report writing software. You can't use the ODBC that's normally used for the Dynamics GP connection because the one used for writing reports needs to point to a specific database. We'll look at setting up the ODBC connection in just a moment. One thing that we would recommend is that you create a SQL user specifically for writing the label reports, rather than using SA, for example. Most of the software, like NiceLabel or WASP Labeler, they have the ability to store the SA password so that the user doesn't have to re-enter it every time they run the report. However, that does mean that you're storing the SA password in a less secure manner, and if you ever change the SA password, then the reports won't work and you'll have to reset the reports with the new password. So that becomes a little bit of a maintenance hassle. So if you create a user specifically for writing the reports, you can set it up with very limited security. So what we've done here is we have a user called NiceLabel, which we've granted access to the sample company database, TWO. And then we've given the NiceLabel user access only to the LabelLink view and granted the user only select permissions. This user is also created without a password. Then, since it doesn't have a password, you don't have to ever worry about the users getting trapped outside of being able to run the report because they don't know the password or the password changed. And since we've set the security in a very limited fashion, even if another user was able to gain access to the database through the LabelLink user, the only thing they're going to be able to do is select from this one LabelLink view. So there's really not a whole lot they could do with it anyway. Keep in mind when creating the ODBC data source that, at least at the time of this video, all of the labeling software packages that are supported by LabelLink are all 32-bit applications. So you'll need to create a 32-bit ODBC source, which means you need to launch the ODBC admin from the syswhile64 folder. So here's our NiceLabel data source. You select the server that you're connecting to. We'll log in with SQL authentication using our NiceLabel login ID with no password. Connect to SQL Server for additional settings. Change to the default database to your company database, and then unmark the other checkboxes. On the DSN configuration, unmark all of these checkboxes, and then test the ODBC connection. So now that we have our special user set up on the SQL Server and we've created a ODBC connection, we're ready to start creating a label report. And for this example, we're going to use NiceLabel. So you go up to File, New, and the first several steps of this run through a wizard. At this point, you'd select your label printing printer. Select the label stock that you're going to use. There's some additional printer settings, but you can just accept the defaults on these. Okay, so that's it for the default setup to get going with the label. The next step is to connect to the data source. So go to Database, Create Database Connection, select Installed Database Drivers, and here's the nice label data source that we just created. Now at this point it can take quite a while as it's looking for the database objects, so we'll just stop for a moment and let it think. The process of it looking for the tables can take several minutes, so I pause the recording during that time, and now the table list is complete, and in here we want to look for the LabelLink View. Okay, so we select the LabelLink View and click Next, and at this point it's reading through the LabelLink View, gathering a list of all the columns. This step can also take quite a while, so we'll take another pause while it's thinking about this step. Okay, so it now has the complete list of columns. Just keep all of them selected. They won't all be placed on the label, but you do want to include all of them in case you need them. You'll notice here that the first two columns are machine ID and user ID. We'll take a look at setting up a restriction on those a little bit later. So once you have the list of columns, click Next. You want to keep these two default options here. I want to print all records from the table and print one label for each record in the database. There's no need to change anything on this window, so just click Finish. Now before we begin putting fields onto the label report, it's helpful to go back into SQL Server and query the LabelLink view to see what the data looks like. So you can see that these first two columns were populated by the machine ID and the user ID. We'll need to put a restriction in the report that pulls data based on one of these two fields. The most commonly used field will be the user ID. If you have multiple users printing labels, each user will have their own report that has the report will have a restriction on it based on user ID. So when SA prints labels, the report will only pull records out of the table where user ID equals SA, and when less than user 1 prints labels, those records will also be in this table, but user ID will be less than user 1. So by having that user ID restriction, the reports automatically know which labels to print. The LabelLink setup, if you recall, links a specific label report to a user ID. So LabelLink knows that when SA is printing labels, to launch the report that was designed for SA. So let's just scroll through the table a little bit. One thing to notice is there are some special fields in here that convert dates into strings. So if you want to put the manufacturing date or the expiration date on the report, you can use this column rather than using this column. And that same formatting applies to every date field that's in the table. So in this case, the last order date in GP becomes the last order date string. And then there's a large number of unused columns depending on which transactions are involved in the report. So for example, end quantity and start quantity, start date, these are all columns for manufacturing orders. And then there's several columns for fixed assets. And then there's a large number of columns related to sales transactions. And they're all prefixed with SOP header and SOP UDF, so it tells you where the data is coming from. Alright, so now that we have an idea of how the data looks in the LabelLink view, let's go back over to NiceLabel and put some fields on the report and create our label. We're back in NiceLabel now, and we'll create a very simple label. We're just going to put the item number on there as a text field so that we can see the item number, and then we'll also add a barcode. So to add a text field, you click the text button, use existing variable, and then select the field that you want to use and drop it on the report. Now you'll see that it's coming up with a whole bunch of red question marks, and what that tells you is that the field is too long to fit across the label. Now you can fix this by either changing the size of the font to make it much smaller so that it fits, or you can change the field properties. Since we know that the item number field by default is 31 characters long, but most of our item numbers are only 10, we can change it so that it's 10 characters and then it fits on the label. Now we'll also add a barcode, and that's the same process. We'll go back and use existing variable and select our item number field and drop this on the report. Again, it's red because it's too big and it doesn't fit, so you need to resize things to make sure that it fits. And now we'll take a look at our label. So come up to Print, Print Preview, and click the Preview button. And there's our label. Alright, so we've got our label. The next step will be to add the user ID restriction to it. To create the user ID restriction, go up to Database, Edit Database Properties. It can take quite a while for this database access window to open, so after you select Edit Database Properties, be patient. It will eventually show up. Click the Filter tab, and then click the SQL button. And we'll add the restriction directly to the SQL query. So we'll flip back here to SQL to make sure that we've got the spelling correct, and it's user ID in caps. So let's go back into NiceLabel and make sure that that matches. Okay, so that's all we need to do to create the restriction. Once we get one copy of the report working like we want it to work, then you'll just copy and paste it in Windows Explorer, or save as, make multiple copies of the report, one for each user, and in each user's version of the report, come into this filter and change the user ID to match the user ID from GP. Save the label that you just created with a naming convention that allows you to keep track of which label belongs to which user. Some people do this by putting them in separate folders, or where each folder is named after the user ID, or you can include the name of the user in the file name itself. Then come back into GP and go into the Setup LabelLink window. And now we need to change this file name from the random file that we selected when we began this process to the actual label that we just created. So here's the label file that we just generated, and that returns it here. And you can test whether or not it's actually pointed at the right location by clicking into the file name and clicking the binoculars. This should open up the report in NiceLabel. And you can see it did. Okay, so now we'll save our changes and go back into the PO receipt. And I just closed LabelLink because it was open from when we were doing our testing. So we'll pop open LabelLink. And again, it's using our default label. One thing to keep in mind, if you're going to have multiple different labels, is in the setup window, use a naming convention for the labels so that they sort in an order that's useful. So, for example, putting a asterisk in front of the label name will cause it to sort at the top of this list. If the user has multiple labels, this list will be sorted in alphanumeric order. Alright, so from here, if you click Preview, it will pop open the Preview window. And on the Preview window, you can click Print. Print will open up, in this case, Nice Label, but it'll open up whatever label writing software you're using. And then you can click Print or Preview from the label writing software. So this is a good way to print labels when you're in test mode. Because it allows you to look at the label itself and preview and make sure that everything's coming over as you expect it to. However, when you're actually printing labels in production, you'll just click the print button. So if I click print at this location, from this location, you won't even see Nice Label. It all runs in the background, and you can see GP thinking for a little bit, and then labels pop out of the printer. So we're not going to do that because you can't actually see anything happen. But we'll click Preview, click Print, it's opening up the correct label. If we preview, and you'll see I forgot to save the username with the database. So we'll go back into Nice Label and I'll show you where to store that information. But you can see it is connecting and it's pulling through the right information. To save the ODBC user ID and password, click on Database, Edit Database Properties, and come back into this database access window. Remember that in Nice Label, accessing this window can take a little bit, so after you select Edit Database Properties, be patient. Click the Define button. And then put the user ID and password into this field. You'll recall that we created a special user for this called Nice Label, which doesn't have a password. If you were using SA, this is where you'd put SA, and the password is encrypted, so it's not visible in plain text to the user. But as we discussed earlier, there are some maintenance issues to consider with actually using SA and the SA password. If you ever need to change the password, then all of the reports break. So it's a little bit easier to have a special user with no password. So that brings to a conclusion the technical overview of the LabelLink implementation. We looked at installing the software, setting it up inside of GP. The key step in designing labels, that first label, was to create a dummy label record in setup. So that's an important thing to remember, is that the first thing you want to do is go into GP, set up LabelLink, create a record for SA, and in that label file field, just put a pointer to any application or any file. Doesn't make any difference because you're not going to launch it anyway. Once you have that, you'll be able to access LabelLink, pop it open, and get some data into the preview window. Once you've got data in the preview window, that will help then with creating labels, because you'll actually be able to see that you're getting some results.